the most dangerous thing in the universe, a species that hides its power. The grey hull cracked open along its spine, and what slid free was not grain. For 3 centuries, the cargo manifests of Nexus Spire 91 had said the same thing over and over in the same flat administrative language. Wheat, ore, machine parts, salt. 4,000 identical freighters, all of them carrying nothing more dangerous than breakfast. That was the lie the tyrannic ascendancy had believed when it parked its warships above the station and called the seizure an annexation. Now those same hulls were peeling apart in the dark, one after another, like a long row of teeth opening. The station's cooling vents kept their rhythm through all of it. A low metallic thrum, steady, on schedule, the same sound the dockworkers had heard for as long as anyone could remember. It did not skip. It did not know the world had changed. Inside the open hulls, something black and many-jointed unfolded itself toward the stars. On the bridge of his flagship, Sovereign Marshal Gethkar watched his targeting grid turn, all at once, from a calm administrative green to a red that filled his whole field of vision. He had no time left to understand what the words Iron Ledger meant before the first volley came. No reply came, no warning shot, no second volley needed. The grid did not show retreating ships. It showed empty space where ships used to be. I've read the report on this station twice. It still doesn't explain the vents. Stay close, this gets stranger. Days earlier, before any of that, the only sound in the obsidian rostrum was officials adjusting their collars. Archivist Vale stood at the lowest tier of the chamber, a stack of trade ledgers pressed against his chest, and watched Sovereign Marshal Gethkar climb toward the dais. Gethkar was built like a wall of pale glass, his carapace catching the light in long, fractured lines, a row of campaign medals crowding one shoulder. War had cost him part of a rib once, and he wore the gap like a badge no one was allowed to mention. Nexus Spire 91 has gone unclaimed for 3 centuries, Gethkar said. His voice carried no heat, only the flat certainty of a man reading a grocery list. A trade depot, staffed by clerks, defended by nothing. I moved the council to correct that oversight before dusk. Vale cleared his throat. Marshal, their transit numbers don't make sense for a culture that's small. Their transit numbers are exactly why we are taking it, Gethkar said, without turning. A species this organized and this unarmed is not patient. It is prey that has not noticed the door is open. The council voted before the chime finished ringing. Not one hand stayed down. Vale did not raise his own hand either way. He simply followed the others out, the ledgers still pressed to his chest, already drafting the language he would need for the seizure report. He had filed 40 of these in his career. He expected this one to read exactly like the others. Across the dark, the warships were already moving. On Nexus Spire 91, Director Jesse Vance felt the deck shiver half a second before the alarms caught up to it. He did not look at the screen first. He looked at the small titanium watch in his palm, turned it once between 2 fingers, and only then raised his eyes to the warning lights crawling amber across the far wall. The cooling vents cycled down on their own schedule behind him, that same low thrum, the sound that meant nothing on the station had gone over budget. Vance had always liked that about the sound. It didn't care what was happening. It just kept counting. 16 dreadnoughts filled deep docking ring beta wall to wall, screened by a wall of smaller hulls behind them. The station's outer plating groaned under the pressure of that many engines braking at once, a long, low complaint of metal that ran the length of the dock. In the operations bay below, analyst Marcus Boyd watched the same warships crawl across a wide tactical display, his unlit pipe clicking once against his teeth. "Lock signals incoming on all our docking spines," he said. "Targeting solutions, not scanned sweeps. They're not asking permission." "Stress on the lower arm is climbing," Chief Engineer Sarah Lynn called from the next station, not looking up from her readout, a smear of grease dark across one knuckle. "Nothing critical yet, but it's climbing." Vance closed the watch and slid it into the breast pocket of a tunic that had seen too much salt water to look like anything official. "Then let's not give it a reason to," he said. "Javi, get me a clean line to whoever's giving the orders over there." Comtech Javi worked the board without a word, the routine of it almost bored, the way a man might dial a number he'd called 100 times before. A channel opened. Somewhere on the other end, something vast and patient was waiting to be heard. Vance did not stand. He did not raise his voice or call for backup or ask Boyd to confirm the obvious. He reached for the comm switch the same way he reached for his morning tea, and for one long second before he pressed it, the only sound in the operations bay was the station's vents, cycling down, right on schedule, as if nothing above the dock had changed at all. He pressed the switch. Gethkar's face filled the channel a heartbeat later, all pale quartz and burning yellow slits, framed by a bridge crew standing rigid behind him. He did not waste time on greetings. "You have 5 minutes to confirm transfer of this station's assets to Ascendancy Command," he said. "Cargo manifests, fuel reserves, transit schedules, personnel registries. Resist, and the 5 minutes becomes nothing at all. There will be no negotiation. There will be no extension. There will be no exceptions." His voice never rose. He didn't need it to. Boyd's pipe stopped clicking against his teeth. "He's not bluffing on the timer," he said quietly. "Reading his weapons bays, every one of them's hot." "We're outgunned in every direction that matters," Lynn added, eyes still on her readout, voice flat and businesslike, the way she'd report a coolant leak. "I'm not seeing a version of this where we win a fight." "Good thing we're not having one," Vance said. He keyed the channel open. "Confirmed. Transfer accepted." Across the bridge, Gethkar's posture shifted, something close to surprise crossing features built for very little of it. He had expected delay. He had expected pleading. He had not expected a man to simply agree. "One condition," Vance added, before the silence could close. "Don't touch the automated departure schedules. Cargo's already queued on a cycle. Mess with the timing and you'll have idle freighters jamming every dock on the station. Bad for everyone." Gethkar's ocular slits narrowed, considering it for exactly as long as it took to decide it didn't matter. "Granted," he said. "Keep your toys running, Clark. It changes nothing." The channel cut. Vance sat back in the battered chair and folded the watch shut. Behind him, the vents cycled down on schedule, that same low thrum, untouched by anything that had just happened. The boarding parties came through deep docking ring beta within the hour, boots loud against decking that had never carried that much weight at once. Enforcers in segmented black armor moved through the concourses in pairs, weapons low but ready, eyes scanning rows of cargo bins and silent dockworkers who never once looked up from their data pads. One young enforcer paused at a loading gate, frowning at a stack of freight crates that hummed faintly under his palm. He glanced at his sergeant, who waved him forward without slowing. "Climate control," the sergeant said. "These people refrigerate their grain. Move." The enforcer moved. Nobody on the station argued. Nobody begged. The dockworkers kept logging shipments, kept routing freighters out on their schedules, kept doing exactly what they'd done the day before and the day before that, as if an occupying fleet were just another line item to process. The Ascendancy soldiers read that silence as surrender. It was easier than reading it any other way. Days bled together after that, marked only by shift changes and the vents cycling down every 40 minutes, the one clock on the station nobody had bothered to occupy. It was during one of those long, identical stretches that Archivist Vale, installed as the council's liaison and given full access to the station's records as a matter of procedure, sat down to run the compliance audit nobody had asked him to rush. He poured himself a cup of something bitter from the station's commissary, took one sip, made a face, and set it aside half-finished. Routine work deserved routine attention, not urgency. He pulled the registry for the secondary berths, 4,000 grey hulls, moored wing to wing along the outer rim, every one of them logged as standard bulk freighters. The reactor readings didn't match the registry. A bulk freighter idled cold, barely a flicker on its core. These ships sat warm. Not warm the way an engine left running sits warm. Warm the way something sits when it is waiting, fully charged, for one more instruction. Vale ran the diagnostic twice, certain he'd transposed a digit somewhere. He hadn't. He pulled the hull schematics next, the cargo bay doors specifically, and stared at the clearance measurements until the shapes stopped looking like doors and started looking like something else. Something built to let a much larger object rotate through, swing outward, and lock into a firing arc. No grain readings anywhere on the manifest. No fuel signatures matching the stated cargo. No reason at all for a freighter to need that kind of clearance unless it had never been a freighter. His hand had gone still over the console. He realized, distantly, that he'd stopped breathing somewhere in the last minute and made himself start again, slow and shallow, the air tasting of recycled metal and his own cold sweat. 4,000 of them, sitting in the dark, warm. Vale's hands were already moving before the rest of him caught up. He keyed the priority channel reserved for council emergencies, a line he had never once used in 40 years of service, and started talking before the connection even confirmed. This is Archivist Vale, Station Liaison, Priority Override. The hulls in the secondary berths are not freighters. I repeat, the 4,000 hulls are not. The line caught, held for 6 seconds, then dropped into a Q tone, soft and patient, built for routine traffic. Priority request received. Estimated processing. Standard. He tried again. Same tone, same cue. On Gethkar's bridge, a fractured transcript reached the command display, every third word lost to interference. Hulls, not. Cargo, warn. The comms officer read it once and forwarded it without comment, the way he forwarded 100 such fragments a day. Gethkar gave it less attention than that. An archivist panicking over a delayed shipment, he said. Market administrative noise. He turned back to the tactical display, where something had finally caught his interest. Dozens of grey hulls along the outer ring were releasing their berths, drifting loose from the station's docking arms like teeth working free of a jaw. There it is, he said, almost pleased. Instinct at last. His second-in-command, a younger officer with 2 campaign sigils to his name, frowned at the readout. They're not running for the lanes, Marshal. They're just detaching. No course laid in. Run from a fleet you cannot outpace and you don't bother with a course, Gethkar said. You simply scatter and hope. It tells you everything about what they actually understand of war. He waved a talon at the display, dismissing it. Let them scatter. It changes nothing about the timeline. Back on Nexus Spire 91, a junior enforcer found Vale still hunched over his console, the Q tone still chiming patiently in his ear. Archivist. The enforcer's voice was bored, procedural. Transit Authority Directive. Non-essential personnel clear command access during transfer finalization. I am not finished with this audit. You are now. The enforcer didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply stood at Vale's shoulder until Vale rose, the ledgers cold under his arm, and let himself be walked toward the lower concourse like a man being escorted out of his own office. No alarms tripped behind him. No weapons drew. No word of what he'd found reached anyone who might have acted on it. Down in the operations bay, the mood was almost ordinary. Boyd clicked his unlit pipe against his teeth 3 times, the same rhythm he always used when a console was taking too long to load. You ever notice, he said, to no one in particular, that in 3 centuries nobody's ever once asked why the pipe's unlit? Because nobody cares, Marcus, Lynn said, not looking up from a panel. I care. You don't smoke it. You've never smoked it. It's a prop. It's a comfort object. Boyd finally got his readout to load and went quiet, scanning it. Then, a beat later, not quiet at all. Ha! Lynn glanced over. What? Docking clamps along the outer berths. They're cycling open on a release schedule. Not random. even spacing every few seconds, working outward from the center berths to the edges. He tapped the screen. That's not in any manifest I've ever seen. Could be the occupiers, reorganizing the moorings. Could be. Boyd didn't sound like he believed it. He glanced toward Vance's chair, found it empty, and didn't ask where the director had gone. On this station, that question rarely got a useful answer anyway. The vents cycled down behind them on schedule, the way they did every 40 minutes, that same low metallic thrum settling through the deck plates. Nobody in the bay looked up at the sound. It had never once meant anything was wrong. It was the one clock on Nexus Spire 91 that the Ascendancy had never bothered to ask about. 3 decks up, in what had briefly served as the station's administrative office, a section commendator reviewed the final transfer paperwork with the bored thoroughness of a man closing out a routine seizure. Director Vance's authorization code sat at the bottom of the document, exactly where it had been entered at the start of the occupation, exactly where Vance himself had placed it. Transfer authorization active, the commendator reported into his channel, running the standard handshake against all registered station assets now. On the display, a counter began climbing. 400, 800, 12. How long on a full asset sink? Gethkar asked, half listening, his attention still on the scattering freighters beyond the hull. Routine systems work, Marshal. A few minutes. There's a great deal of registered cargo to confirm. Gethkar didn't ask what the cargo was. He had already decided he knew. The counter kept climbing, one registered asset at a time, each confirmation logged under the same authorization code, each one tagged, invisibly, to a system neither the commendator nor his marshal had any reason to question. 3,000, 3,400. Curious, the commendator murmured, almost to himself, watching the tally close in on a round number he hadn't expected from a cargo manifest. It's almost exactly 4,000 assets, down to the unit. It's a trading depot, Gethkar said, not turning from the window, not looking at the number at all. Of course they keep an exact count. That's the entire point of these people. File it when it's done. The counter reached 3,900 and held there, ticking upward one digit at a time, patient, exact, and entirely unremarked by anyone watching it. The counter sat at 3,900 for 4 full seconds, long enough that even the section commendator stopped watching it and went back to his paperwork. In the operations bay, Vance reached for the cup of chicory tea Javi had left at his elbow an hour ago, found it gone cold, and drank it anyway, the way he drank most things on this station. He set the cup down without comment. He opened the watch in his other hand, checked it once, and closed it again with a small, unhurried click. Javi, he said, confirm all departure queues are still locked to my authorization. Confirmed, sir, same as it's been all week. Good. Vance stood, smoothed the front of his salt-stained tunic, and looked toward the dark glass that faced the docking ring. Run it. The counter on the commendator's display ticked forward one last time and stopped climbing. Across 12,000 kilometers of berthed hulls, every one of the 4,000 grey freighters released its outer casing at the same instant, the seams along each hull splitting clean along lines that had been cut and waiting for 300 years. The young enforcer who had once waved a recruit past a humming crate of climate-controlled grain was standing watch near the outer berths when the panel beside him fell away. He had just enough time to see what was underneath it, black, jointed, already turning to track a target, before the targeting light on his own sidearm went dark and stayed dark, drained by something he never identified. On the bridge, Gethkar's display did exactly what the cold dark had promised it would. 16 capital ships, green a moment before, burned red across every screen at once. He had no words ready for that. He had never needed any before. No warning came from the freighters. No demand, no broadcast, no gloating voice on the channel. There was only the railguns finding their marks, and the marks finding nowhere to go. A section commendator 3 decks above Vale's empty office watched his own authorization log scroll past on a secondary screen, the same code attached to every line, the same name stamped at the bottom of every order he had carried out all week. Director Jesse Vance, it read, Asset Custodian. He had filed it as a formality. It had been the firing key the entire time. In the operations bay, Boyd's pipe had stopped clicking against his teeth entirely. He watched the same external feed the rest of the galaxy was about to watch. 16 capital signatures dropping off a tactical board one by one, and said nothing for the better part of a minute. "That's a lot of ships," Javi finally said, voice small. "That's the point," Lynn said, not unkindly. She didn't look away from the screen either. Her hands had gone still on her console, the grease smudge on her knuckle catching the light each time a new flare bloomed and died on the display. "We're not the ones who get to flinch." Vance didn't watch the feed at all. He stood by the dark glass with his back to the room, watching the reflection of the station's own berths instead, where the last of the resealed hulls were already easing shut, one after another, in the same unhurried order they'd opened in. We did not spend the centuries dodging conflicts. We spent them engineering the exact space to end one. Gethkar's flagship took the first hit to its forward shield array and the second to the bridge itself, a quarter-second apart, close enough that he never finished the order he was halfway through giving. The blast threw him from his command chair and across the deck, his carapace cracking along one shoulder in a long white fracture that would never fully heal. The crossfire lasted 22 minutes, measured later by people who had reason to count such things precisely. It did not feel like minutes to anyone aboard the Vanguard fleet. It felt like the sky deciding, all at once, that it had run out of patience. When the firing stopped, 15 of the 16 dreadnoughts were vapor, debris, and slow-tumbling wreckage. The 16th drifted, gutted, its engines dead, alive only because its reactor core had failed before the railguns reached it. Aboard that hulk, a junior officer found Sovereign Marshal Gethkar pinned beneath a fallen support strut, one talon broken, his 5 ocular slits dimmed to a faint flicker. He did not order a counterattack. There was nothing left to counter with. The officer who pulled him free was the same one who had questioned the detaching freighters an hour earlier, the one Gethkar had waved off without listening. He didn't say anything about being right. He just got the marshal upright and pointed him toward the one working lift on a ship that no longer had a working bridge. A single battered scout craft was permitted through the wreckage field 3 hours later, unescorted, its hull pocked with shrapnel scars. It carried what remained of the bridge crew, the broken marshal, and one archivist who had spent the entire battle locked in a maintenance closet on Nexus Spire 91, listening to the deck shake through 3 layers of bulkhead. Vale spent most of that flight saying nothing at all. The young officer who'd freed Gethkar sat across from him, his arm in a temporary sling, watching the stars crawl past the viewport with the flat stare of a man who had not yet decided what he felt about anything. "You tried to warn him," the officer said eventually. "It wasn't a question." "I tried," Vale said. "The channel cued me behind a cargo complaint." "Would it have mattered if he'd heard you?" Vale thought about that for a long moment, turning his ledgers over in his lap, the same ledgers he'd carried into the rostrum the day this began. "No," he said finally. He'd already decided what they were before I ever opened my mouth. I could have shown him the schematics myself, and he'd have called it administrative panic. The officer didn't argue with that. He didn't have anything left to argue with. The obsidian rostrum was colder than Vale remembered it. He stood at the lowest tier again, the same place he had stood the day the council voted to take a cargo depot before dusk, and this time no one in the chamber adjusted their collars or shuffled their feet. They simply watched him, waiting. He set the casualty file on the reading stand. He did not summarize it. He let the council read the number themselves. 16 ships, every crew aboard them, gone in less time than it took to walk from the rostrum's outer doors to its dais. "They were never clerks," he said. We filed an armed civilization under trade logistics because their paperwork was good and their weapons were better hidden. The manifests were correct the entire time. We only ever asked the wrong question of them. A counselor near the back rose before the silence could settle. Then why, she said, did they not simply destroy the fleet the moment it arrived? Why occupy first? Why wait 72 hours to act if the weapons were ready from the start? Vale had asked himself the same question on the scout craft, turning it over the whole way home. Because they didn't need to rush, he said. A species that spends 3 centuries hiding an armada inside a shipping ledger isn't interested in winning a fight quickly. They're interested in making sure no one ever has a reason to start one with them again. The 72 hours weren't hesitation. They were the proof. No one on the council corrected him. No one offered a counter-theory. Across the chamber, someone quietly struck Nexus Spire 91 from the list of viable annexation targets, and then, after a long pause, struck every system bordering it as well. In the chamber's lowest gallery, Gethkar sat with his fractured shoulder bound in a medical brace, his row of campaign sigils stripped from his uniform and laid in a small box on the table before him, as if someone had thought he might want to keep them. He did not reach for the box. He stared instead at his remaining talons, flexing them slowly, watching them shake. He had told a council once that a species this organized could not be biologically capable of war. He had been precise about it. He had been wrong in every direction precision could be wrong. Far across the dark, back above the dead gas giant, Nexus Spire 91 carried on exactly as it had for 3 centuries. Freighters logged their cargo. Dockworkers checked their pads. Director Jesse Vance sat in his battered chair, watch closed in his palm, and did not look up when Boyd reported that 3,999 of the 4,000 outer hulls had already resealed themselves along the same hydraulic lines they'd split from, ready for the next delivery run. One hull stayed open. No one on the station mentioned why, and no one asked. The station's cooling vents cycled down into the quiet, the same low metallic thrum they always made, resetting for the next delivery run as if the armada had never been there at all. Vance set the watch on the console beside him, face up, and let it tick.